G'day, and welcome back to the third season of True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. I hope you all had a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year with your families. Thanks to all those who have supported the podcast, and a special welcome to new listeners. What a lineup of great guests and topics we have for you this year. On today's podcast, we'll be joining my good mate, Battlefield Guide for Matt McLaughlin Battlefield Tours, Pete Smith, on a walk around the iconic Belgian town of Ypres, known as Ypres to the Allied soldiers. The town and surrounding countryside were the scene of some of the most fierce and tragic events on the Western Front during the Great War. Hi Pete, thanks for joining us on the show.
Hi Adam, great to be back with you again.
No, thanks Pete. It's great to have you back on the show again and doing something a little bit different. So Pete, we're talking about the town of Ypres and the significance of the town of Ypres in World War One. So Pete, can you just give us a little bit of background about why and why it was so important during World War One, and a little bit of history on the town?
Right, well, let's start with the name Wipers. Ypres. Not leper, as occasionally people call it. It's up to you what you call it. I don't really mind when I'm guiding people around, as long as they know what I'm talking about. It is a little confusing just because of the various spellings of it as well. Because wipers is something that we normally, the soldiers would have called it, because that's what it looks like. Y-P-R-E-S, wipers. Pronounced Eep, and that's a French spelling. That's the French spelling of the town. And then there's the Flemish, and of course this is a Flemish city. The Flemish people, they speak a Dutch dialect. It's effectively Dutch with a twist, and it's I-P-E-E-R. It looks like Ypres, and that's why some people get confused. They think that I is actually a lowercase L, and then it looks like leper. So it's not that, and in fact in both languages it's pronounced very similar. So it's Ypres. I can't do the bit on the end, but Ypres, a medieval city. It's been in existence for hundreds and hundreds of years, and in fact the Cloth Hall, perhaps something we're going to be talking about in a minute, the most famous part of the city. Built in the 1200s, so we can tell from that right the way back to the medieval period, and even earlier. The local tribes would have lived in this area. We're on low-lying ground, so that's the other thing to think about. There's no real hills immediately around the town. Well, there are actually little ridges, and very often for people, especially New Zealanders, who when we talk about ridges, or anybody that lives in an area where there's a fairly mountainous countryside, ridges, that's what you get. You get this idea of highland, high ridges. Well, the ridges here are just little ripples in the landscape. And Hill 60. Which is just outside the town, 60 metres. It's on the ridge around the town, 60 metres above sea level. And Ypres itself is almost on sea level. The other thing to say about the town is it's a port, and that confuses people, because we are a good 3/4 of an hour away driving in a modern car away from the coast. And one of the nearest ports on the coast is Dunkirk, obviously famous for the retreat of the British Army in 1940, withdrawal across the Channel to Britain. And so a port, why is it a port? Well, it's because canals were dug. Canals were dug to the city from the coast, and vessels were brought up to pick up, in the main, bringing wool and taking back cloth to wherever, predominantly Britain, you have to say, or England as it was then. And so very much like Bruges, for those of you that are listening that have been to Bruges. Bruges is a medieval city that was not destroyed in the First World War, because, of course, this city was destroyed in the First World War. Bruges was not, and Bruges is also a Flemish city. It's larger, but it also still has its canal network. So we get an idea of what the town would have once looked like. So a very old-fashioned town.
So Pete, we starting in the centre square itself, and tell us a little bit about the square, and after what was left after the fighting, what can you see today?
Well, interestingly, one of the things that strikes you straight away is almost everything is built out of brick. There's very little stonework here. In fact, I suppose the larger buildings that are built out of stone, the Cloth Hall and the church behind it, St. Martin's, they have an element of stonework in it, but also there's brick as well. And so bricks here are very important. And perhaps I should start with this conversation. One of the things that was being traded in the medieval period were bricks. This is where bricks are reinvented. So if you were going to go to Hampton Court in England, in Britain, along the banks of the Thames, well, it's built with Flemish bricks. So bricks were being brought back to the UK in the medieval period to build some of the posh houses of the time. The reason being that we hadn't reinvented how to make them. This is the area where we reinvented. Effectively, the knowledge of brickmaking was lost when the Romans departed. So it's famous for its bricks, and the town looks like it's built out of lots of bricks, but of course what you're looking at, and you have to keep constantly reminding yourself, because this town by the end of the Great War, 1914 to 1918, by the end of the Great War, this town had been obliterated. There is very little left of the original town, and yet a great effort was put into recreating what had been there. And so it's a town that you have to keep pinching yourself to remind yourself that it is effectively a mock-up. It is a replica, a very beautiful replica of what had been here before. So I suppose the question we have to really ask is why is this town so crucial to the First World War? Why does it mean so much to anybody from around the Commonwealth who had relatives who fought or just is aware of the First World War? Then this is the place that you tend to come to. Several reasons. One, because it is famous, and so you tend to go to famous places. It's also got very good accommodation, lots of range of hotels here. Other places around the battlefields, not quite so many hotels and places to stay. And this feels like a tourist town. It is a tourist town, not just built on pilgrims and people. The early name for the people returning to generally use the term pilgrims coming back to the battlefields. But it was also it's a modern town that people want to visit. There's a lot going on. I always would describe it for those that from the UK who know what a county town is. Effectively, a county town is like a better town. It feels a little bit smarter. Perhaps we could describe it as a bit posh. I come from East Yorkshire. Not that many places around the area of Hull that are posh, but Beverley, in fact, where I went to school, outside of Hull and in the middle of East Yorkshire, is a beautiful county town. That's a county town. So it's where you go, not necessarily to do your annual shopping, even though most of these towns now have big supermarkets, but it's a place you go to buy your posh clothes and to go and have a look in some of the shops. So it's a beautiful place, and it certainly attracts an awful lot of people. And just I'm going to do a quick advert for the city. If you haven't been, go, because they certainly need you to be there at the moment. Have 2 years of COVID, and it's been a real struggle for anywhere that really relies upon tourism. So a beautiful town, and perhaps the building that we're standing in front of is the most important. It's the Cloth Hall.
So, Pete, you just mentioned the Cloth Hall, and it's a good time to actually talk about the Cloth Hall and what it was before the Great War, and then what happened to it during the 4 years of the Great War. So can you tell us about the Cloth Hall? We're standing in front of it, and what's its history and its significance?
Well, it's not as you would normally see it at the moment, because believe it or not, started building it in 1200. It was basically destroyed during the Great War, and it took them to the 1960s to completely rebuild the Cloth Hall. So finished in the 60s, the final touches in the 1960s. And they're now taking down the tower at the moment. And so we have it's covered in scaffolding and actually doing it very cleverly. So they're putting up pictures on the scaffolding of the tower in its complete form. So you don't really notice too much. Well, you do. I'd be lying if I didn't say that you do. You do. You can tell. You can tell. And they're actually taking it down for safety reasons. It's time for a rebuild. There was a lot of problems in the early building of a lot of the buildings that were rebuilt in the early 20s. After the First World War, they wanted to get them up quickly, so a lot of buildings were rushed. And also, you have to remember what the landscape is here. We're based on clay; it doesn't like supporting big structures, so they're doing some really important work. So the tower is coming down; it's going to be completely rebuilt back up again. I think it's talking about 10 years before it's completely finished and done. But it's so it's under a bit of a refit at the moment. It doesn't spoil it. It doesn't spoil your experience, and I quite like it. It's part of the history of the tower. You are part of the history of where the tower was taken down. It's going to go back up again, and it'll be here for hundreds and hundreds of years in the future without any problems. So it's a most essential part of the building. So back to the reason how it was destroyed. Well, it's destroyed like most tall buildings are because your enemy doesn't want you to use it as an observation platform. And by the time the Germans are in artillery range, and that's the big problem, and it's why the city is going to be destroyed, because we have multiple battles of Ypres. The first battles of Ypres, first and second, are effectively defensive battles. They're the French who were based in the town itself at the beginning of the war, and the British come in and take over. And it's about, first of all, the French and then the British trying to hold the Germans from taking the city. Which is difficult considering that there is this small ridge that almost runs right round at least 2/3 of the city, and the Germans are going to be ensconced on those ridges for a great period of the war. Hence, they can see what's going on and they can bombard the town. So it's under a fairly constant bombardment for a long period of the Great War, and that will see its total destruction eventually. So you have to ask yourself, why on earth are we hanging on to it? What is the point of us hanging on to a town that is under such heavy bombardment? Well, there's a point of honour. We don't want this town to be given up to the Germans. We are holding it, and we will continue to hold it. They've taken most of Belgium. You have to remember, Belgium itself is supposed to be a neutral country in the Great War, overrun almost by the Germans. The Belgian government evacuated to Britain, as did quite a few of the people. The Belgian army, a great number of the Belgian army were captured or surrendered. The Belgians still hold a section near the coast, but there is very little of Belgium left in our control. And if we were to pull back even further to put the fighting onto a level playing field, almost literally, then it would mean that, again, we'd lose a bit more of the country, and there's not that much more of the country to hang on to. The thing you have to remember as well, or be aware of, is that the reason that Britain is fighting this war, and hence the Empire is fighting this war, was to defend Belgian neutrality and also keep the Germans away from the coastline here. It wasn't necessary to go straight in and assist the French. It was to defend Belgian neutrality. And if you've been nitpicky, you'd say we haven't done a particularly good job, even though we really had with the size of army that we had. But you could perceive that since most of Belgium is under German control, then perhaps we could have done better. That's absolutely not a criticism of the British Army, which has almost fought itself out of existence, the regular British Army, in getting to this point in 1915 where we're hanging on.
So, Pete, we've got the fighting happening in and around the town of Ypres. And for those people who aren't aware, what happened was there was a salient that formed around the town. For people who don't have a military background or a sense of what a salient is, can you explain to the listener what a salient actually is?
Yeah, what you need to look at to get the real feel of what a salient is a good model or a good map that shows the gradients, so you can see height contour lines. And effectively, a salient is something that is jutting out into a different landscape. So in other words, it's abutting a different landscape. And in this case, it's high ground. So it's a bulge around the city that is surrounded by the high ground. So the high ground is all the way around it. So it's completely, well, at least on 2/3 of the side, surrounded by higher ground. Now, this is not really, really high ground, but if you've studied the Great War in any degree or not, one of the things that is very obvious after a while, especially when you walk the ground, is that height is so important. And so that little bit of height, 60 meters or less, well, the difference between on that 60 meters and below it is enormous. It's not always obvious. Certainly when you're looking up, you very rarely, quite often on the salient, as you're walking the salient, because that's what it becomes known as, you're walking out of the city onto the salient, it becomes quite difficult to really perceive that there's a great deal of height. But when you're on those ridges looking back, it's very, very different. You get a very different perspective. And so I highly recommend that if you're coming to the town and you're enjoying looking at the museums, the Cloth Hall has a museum. That is where the actual museum is, the Flanders Fields Museum. if you're coming into the town and you're enjoying your beers, which we all do, or most of us do, or eating the Flemish food, which is also very good in the town, then you need to make sure that you jump on either a coach, drive on it, get a guide, go out into the landscape beyond the town itself.
A good example, Pete, of this and what you're mentioning with going to the ridge is actually going to Tynecott Cemetery, and you actually walk up on in the centre of the cemetery where you stand on the cross of sacrifice, and you actually go up the stairs and the little seat on top, and you can actually look back. And it doesn't look like much, does it, Pete?
No.
With the you look back and you think, hang on, it looks flat here, but there is a rise. There is a little rise, and you do see it from a military sense, that, like you're saying, around Hill 60 and also Tynecott, where having a little bit of height was key, and having the high ground, especially in Flanders where it's so flat, is a massive advantage to any fighting army.
Yeah, it is indeed. It's absolutely crucial, and you do need to go out and have a look. Having said that, you can actually get a bit more of a feel of the landscape, because you can actually, under normal circumstances, so you may not be able to do this if it does take 10 years, but you can normally go up the tower, which obviously is being taken down at the moment. But for the cloth hall, when you book the museum, you can actually book a visit up to the top of the tower. And it's very odd, because it's not like Australia or Britain, where we're a little bit of a nanny state and we like everything to be all completely safe and fenced in. You get up onto the top of the tower, and it's quite open up there, and makes some people quite feel quite peculiar if you're not used to being able to hurl yourself off a building, which you could if you wanted to quite easily. So it's you get a great view across the battlefields, and certainly when it was rebuilt by the 1930s, just before the Second World War, when it got to a height where people could actually get up to the top, it was a great place to take photographs. And certainly my collection, I've got some photographs taken at the time from the top of the tower as they start to rebuild it.
Well, Pete, that's something that I didn't know, that you could go to the top of the tower. I've been over 3 times, and I didn't know that you could go to the top of the tower. I've been in the Flanders Fields Museum, and it's one thing that I didn't know, Pete, that you could actually go to the. It would have been a really good thing. Now I'm going to miss the opportunity when I come back.
You know why we don't do it, Adam? We don't do it because it takes too long. When you've got a tour group with you, it takes too long to get everybody up and down the tower. So we don't tend to advertise it.
Pete, if I can remember to, I mean, a similar tower that comes to mind is Villas Bretner, and those stairs, Pete, they would take some time to get to the top. Yeah.
From a guiding perspective, I now stay at the bottom and say I don't need to go up, but it's because my knees are killing me, but going up and down there all the time.
But if you, I do know what you're talking about, Pete. Where it wouldn't be, it'd take too long. It's one of those.
It is.
It's one of those things. But we should, Pete, while we're talking about the tower, we'll talk about the Flanders Museum. What are your thoughts on the museum and what it is today, and what it was? Like they've recently done an upgrade. What are your thoughts on the museum?
Well, I suppose the upgrade now, thinking about it, it's probably getting on for 10 years ago, I suppose, or at least 8 years ago. It's funny how time goes past, but it was shut for some time, almost 2 years, while they re-tweaked the museum, and in fact did more than retweak it. And I was hoping for great things. Now, it's not to say I don't like it. Museums all have a theme of how they are to look. It's got a fantastic story. It tells the great story of the town. It tells the story of everybody that was here. They've had exhibitions on the Chinese Labour Corps in the past, and there's all sorts. It's a fantastic museum, but it's not a museum that overly appeals to me. I'm an old school. I like cabinets full of things and stuff everywhere and things you can pick up and have a look at. And of course, it's not quite that kind of museum. It's one of the more modern, all singing, all dancing museums. It's very clever, a lot of computer stuff that you can do. It also has, and I have to say I'm not sure about this, it has a very much an anti-war feel about it. And it's because it perceives itself as an anti-war city. It saw so much war in both phases and previously. You have to say this area has been fought over 4 centuries, literally. So it perceives itself as an anti-war city, and it encourages people to learn about war here, but to understand the horror of it. And I understand that as well. I can understand that totally. But sometimes that can take away a little bit from the story that you're trying to learn about the men and things here. So I would say another great museum. Just outside the Passchendaele Museum, outside the city on the ridges. And I always say, if you can, and again on most of my tours you cannot, there's no time, but try and get to both. Try and get to the Passchendaele Museum as well, because that tells a different version of the story, or perhaps it's the same story, but it's just in how they display it and what they show you. And I think it makes it a little bit more interesting. But I would recommend that people go to both. And then there are other museums in the area as well. We're going off tangent here completely, as normal.
That's all right.
One of my little chats. And Hooge, which is on the Menin Road, literally. There's a very good private museum there, which is in a cafe restaurant on the little village. It's a little village of Hooge. Soldiers would have called it Hooge. I tend to stick to the pronunciations that the soldiers would have used, and and that's fantastic. I mean, I think it gets voted in Belgium one of the best, if not the best, private museums in the country. So it's fantastic, well worth another visit if you're stopping for lunch there, which we quite often do when we're exploring the battlefields. So yeah, if you can, go and see as many museums as you can. But more importantly, get out there on the ground, go and walk the ground.
Pete, it's something that you just touched on then when you said that the Flanders Field Museum is a very anti-war. Well, after the fighting in 1918, it was actually suggested by Winston Churchill that they actually don't rebuild the town and leave it as a ruins. And thank God, Pete, they didn't listen to Winston and they've rebuilt the town, because it's a beautiful town, isn't it? Now it's you often catch yourself thinking, like you said, it was built right up to the 1960s, but you often catch yourself sometimes thinking, oh, I'm in a medieval town, but this whole town has been rebuilt.
Yeah, as I said, you have to pinch yourself because it's they've done such a good job. What you just touched upon, and Churchill and the committee and the building of memorials. I mean, this was seen as, because of the loss of life in the surrounding area. I think we calculated that about 1 in 4 of the Empire's dead fell around Eep. So you get an idea of the hundreds of thousands of men that fell in the Great War. Just under 1 million men, I think, for the Empire. That's very broad, I'm afraid. But it was very important that they created a centre of remembrance, really, I suppose. And it was here that they decided to build. I'm not sure if we'll get to it during this talk, but it's certainly on the walk. We're not doing much walking. We're still standing in the square. So the Menin Gate, which you can see from the square if you're looking up the Menin towards the Menin Road, then a fantastic memorial to the Empire, and in fact it is the only Empire memorial, I think, on the battlefields that commemorates the Empire. So all of those people that we now refer to as the Commonwealth, that came from the Commonwealth to support Britain. During the First World War, well, the names of their missing, and you have to say there is, when we go down and walk towards it, there are some variations. New Zealanders are not actually on the walls, but the missing of the salient, the missing soldiers who fought in the area, their names were emblazoned all over that memorial. So yes, but even the building of that was seen as controversial, because that was not the first request. In fact, it's a third request. The second request was, well, let's leave the cloth hall in a destroyed state and we'll have that as a memorial. And again, that's going to be turned down by the Belgian government and people. And I think, thank goodness as well, that it will be rebuilt. And we get this fantastic archway now on the road out that wasn't there previously. There was no arch there, no gateway there. In fact, the gate had been dismantled. I think in the time of Napoleon, it was defortified. Because this town has always been a border town. It's a border between. It was under French under French rule for many, many years, and it's a border town between both the Dutch, the Spanish, because this was once part of the Spanish Netherlands. And it's a place that was very much involved in the religious wars throughout history between the Catholics and the Protestants. So a very warry place, but one that doesn't feel like that any longer, thankfully. All the ramparts and the fortifications are now beautiful walkways, and that's where we want to be heading eventually, if we can ever leave the square. But you don't really want to leave the square. There's a lot of beer in the square as well, which keeps you in there, and nice food. So it's a great place to start any tour. Really, is in the centre of the town, and you can park your car here as well. That's important if you're independently travelling.
It is, Pete, because when you actually, we haven't done much walking yet, but I think it's good to give an overview of what the town, the town itself and the history, and why did the British not pull back and straighten their lines? Why was it so important that they kept Ypres and kept this salient? Why did they not just move the line, straighten the line, and let the town of Ypres fall to the Germans?
Well, it is as I've said, it's mainly because a point of honour. They don't want to lose any more of Belgium, but it is. You have to remember that yes, the Germans are killing us here, but we are also killing the Germans. And if we're holding them here and they're trying to break through here and we're stopping them, then the fighting can successfully go on elsewhere. There are periods when there was, I wouldn't say no fighting here. There's always fighting on the whole of the 700 kilometres of front line from the Channel to the sea. There's fighting going on all the way along it at all times. Soldiers are dying on that whole length, but sometimes there's no attempt to break through. So it's just that it's a point of honour that to hang on to it. I'm just going to talk about something else in the square itself, because the two things can be very much intermingled when you're looking from afar, because directly behind that cloth hall, we have the St. Martin's Cathedral. So just to put it into perspective, we are standing in the Grotmarkt, the Great Square of Eep. We're looking at the cloth hall, and the cloth hall is now a museum, but previously it was used for trading cloth. So it looks very much like a church. It's one of those oddities. It looks like a church. It's got a square tower with a clock face on it, and you'd swear it was a church. It's not. It's basically the weavers' guilds, who were very wealthy in the medieval period. I always view it as effectively saying, look, we can build something that looks like a church, but it's not a church. It's actually, we are as wealthy as the church. It's actually where we trade. It's a trading hall, and that's why it's called the Cloth Hall. It's where cloth was traded. But right behind it, you have to say it's similar, if not exactly the same stonework and brickwork. We have St. Martin's Cathedral, built roughly the same time, 1221. It was begun, and it's also beautiful, and it's also been totally rebuilt. And in fact, it was being used as a shelter up to the August of 1915, when a direct hit killed 20 men that were sheltering within it. And of course, they were sheltering within it because these great big thick walls of the medieval buildings protected them. But yep, that was when it was decided that the town was getting just too dangerous to have men in the open within the buildings, and it eventually will be totally destroyed as well. And it's been rebuilt exactly as it had looked before. And in fact, upstairs on my landing, I've got a print of the town taken from that view I've just described, taken from the marketplace, looking towards the cloth hall with the church behind it, the cathedral behind. And this was a print that was produced and then hand tinted just before the First World War. But there's a difference. If you go and stand in that same spot and you look, you'll get exactly the same perspective. If you go on a market day, and they have markets here at the weekend on Saturday mornings, it feels very medieval. I often get my clients to shut their eyes and imagine being in the square and listen to the noises. They have live animals, there's chickens and things, ducks. There's also people calling, the traders calling out. And you can seriously imagine yourself in a medieval marketplace. But if you open your eyes and look up and look towards the St. Martin's Cathedral, it's got a beautiful spire on it. Well, interestingly, it didn't have a spire on it before the First World War. It's never had a spire. But since they were rebuilding it, they decided to add another 100 metres onto the height of the church by adding this spire. I've always made the joke, of course, because of the payment for rebuilding Europe, certainly France and Belgium, that had been destroyed in the First World War, came from German reparations. In other words, they were paying for it, and they were still paying for it into the 1960s before eventually it would be written off. But anyway, so the Germans are paying for it. I honestly believe that the church elders in the area said, well, since the Germans are going to be paying for the rebuilding of it, let's have that spire that we've always wanted on it. So that's the only difference, is a new 100-meter Gothic spire that wasn't there before the First World War.
And you can, Pete, you can see as you out walking in the battlefield, you can actually see both. You can see the cloth hall and the spire when you're and you look and go, oh, it's very noticeable. As we said, when you're out walking that flat ground. So, Pete, what happens in summer? What happens in summer when we're not talking and walking the battlefields?
Well, I think the great thing about the markets, and this is quite common in Europe, full stop, not common in Britain, I have to say, but these car parks, because that's what most of the square is also used for a multitude of well, there's all sorts going in the year. I mean, on a normal trading year, a normal guiding year, a normal year of me exploring the battlefields with clients and even exploring by myself, I'll be there almost every week. And you see all these changes. There are the market on a Saturday. There are basically fairs. You'll get fairgrounds and fair rides set up. There's a rally a car rally, which starts in the centre of the town at one time in the middle of the year. Cycle races start in the town. I think it's early summer actually. They import thousands of tons of sand, and we have beach volleyball in the centre of the town. So it's great, and I really like that this car park for a lot of the year is also not a car park. It's a civic space. It's an open space, and it is used. Whereas you find that certainly in Britain, I don't know what it's like in Australia or Canada, but or elsewhere. For the other listeners, I don't know what it's like there, but certainly we tend to, when we build a car park, it just remains a car park, and very rarely is it used for anything else. But this is fantastic. It's used for all sorts of things during the year. There's also famously once every, I don't know if I should tell these stories. Some people are horrified by this, but once every 3 years they have the Cat Festival here, which you think, and they try and sell it as this is celebrating cats. In the old days, it was in the medieval period, it was something else. So during these festivals, they kind of culled the cats, and how they culled them was by throwing them off the tower of the cloth hall. I normally can make this into a very long-winded story, but I haven't done today. But we have this cat festival every 3 years, which is great. We have great big automatons and great big enormous great cats and things, and the parade goes on for hours. I was lucky enough to live just outside for a year. I lived just outside the gate, the main gate, and so I was able to watch the parades going past from the balcony of my house, which was very, very with a drink in my hand and a sandwich in the other. And it was it's great. It's every 3 years, that too.
The Triennial Cat Parade, Pete, is what it's called.
Thank you. I knew that.
Yes. So in my notes, Pete, I've actually got it. That it was the symbol of the devil and witchcraft, were thrown off the cloth hall, and because they believed this would get rid of all the evil demons. So that's what the cat parade was, and that's what they believed.
Yeah, I think that's, again, like most things now, there's another reason. It's that the cats were left to kill the rats, and so they were left to breed like the clappers, and every 3 years they had almost as many cats as they had rats, so they had to thin down the cats a bit as well. So I think it's a double whammy going on here. And just to say, there's another place just outside of the town called Besselair. I hope that's how you pronounce it. And Besselair every 3 years has a witches festival, so that's always well worth going to have a look at as well. Yeah.
So Pete, we should mention how many battles of Ypres were there. Let's talk about how many battles of Ypres there actually were.
Okay, so this is very broad here. I'm not going to stick to the exact months and dates of them, but the first Battle of Ypres, and that's late 1914, early 1915. Second Battle of Ypres is 1915. Now, you have to say those are both defensive battles. Those are both us trying to hold the Germans, push them back, but stop them from getting any further towards the coast. Because you have to remember, this is what the Germans want to do. They want to get to the coastline, and this is what the Empire forces and the French and the Belgians all fighting here at various times, and others. We get the Portuguese fighting in this area as well later on. So we are all aiming to stop them getting to the coast and doing this hook around the coastline. So I forgot what your question was, Adam. What was that? What was the question then?
How many battles of Ypres were there? So actually,
right, yeah. So I'm up to 3. So I'm up to that's the first 2. On to the third one. Third Battle of Eep, 1917, and this is the first of the offensive actions. This is an attempt for us to push the Germans off the ridges. So this is our turn to start forcing them off the ridges. There was a hope that we could break through, and there have been discussions about breaking through and us doing a left hook and basically taking some of the Channel ports back from the Germans, and they were causing us a problem because they had both E-boats and U-boats in some of those ports, which were problematic and a worry for us transporting both across the Channel and also from further afield coming across the Atlantic when America gets involved in the war. So they worry about those. It's not going to happen, but we are going to successfully. It is a successful battle, Third Eep. Third Eep now tends to be known by the subtitle, or it should be, of Passchendaele. But Passchendaele is the last phase of Third Eep, the attempt to take the village of Passchendaele, which, for anybody that knows anything about the Great War, or nothing about the Great War, there are 2 names that you will know, and they will be the Somme and Passchendaele. They tend to be high in our psyche when we are thinking of the Great War, and it's the weather that we don't. This podcast is not going to be about Passchendaele because that deserves multiple podcasts in its own right. But that is part of the Third Eep. Then if we want to be nitpicky, we have to say that there is a 4th Battle of Eep, which is the Germans again coming again in their spring offensive. In this area, it was the Georgette offensive, and again we managed to hold them. And then the 5th Battle of Eep, if you really want to be nitpicky, is us coming on the last 100 days, or that attempt to force the Germans back, successful forcing the Germans back towards the end of the war. So effectively, you could say there are 5 battles of Eep, but it's the first 3 that really are high on everybody's. I suppose if most people know anything about the First World War, then certainly the 3rd Battle of Eep, Passchendaele, they'll know about. And perhaps if you're interested in 1914-15, you'll know about the regular British army fighting itself almost out of existence in trying to hold the ridges, aided by the territorials, I should say, and eventually by some of the new army, the volunteers.
Thank you for that overview and how many battles there were. You mentioned St. Martin's Cathedral, so why don't we strap our boots on and why don't we'll walk across the cobblestones and let's head down to the Menin Gate, Pete, the famous Menin Gate, and what can we see as we're walking through the town?
Bars. Lots of bars and chocolate shops, which are very good. It's a packed town. There are tables out on the sidewalks on a normal summer's day. It starts very early, late spring, early summer, and right the way into autumn. So you can sit outside and have a beer and something to eat. A lot of restaurants. But all the time, you are aware of this connection with the Great War. And one of the things that I really enjoy are the cobblestones, because one of the talks that I do sometimes at length, which we haven't got time for here, are the cobblestones, because soldiers in boots hated cobbles. You have to remember that these boots are steel-studded underneath. And if you've ever walked in steel-studded boots, and certainly in my service in the Royal Marines, our dress boots were studded underneath, leather boots, very similar in a way. And if you come to a sharp stop on either cobbles or a marble surface, then your feet tend to not stop and they keep on going. And so soldiers hated walking on cobbles and through towns. They cockle their ankles. I have to say the cobbles nowadays are a lot less cobbly. In other words, they've flattened them a lot more. They used to be a lot more rounded on the surface, because the whole idea of cobbles, I'm going off on tangents again. The whole idea of cobbles was the horse muck went into the gaps in between the cobbles, and you stepped on top of those. And in the night, the cleaners came and swept and washed down the streets, ready for the next day, or after the market they cleaned up. So cobbles were great, and they almost last for forever. They're still reusing them, and you'll see them being reused in areas that are still cobbled. And thankfully, a lot of the town, in fact, most of the town is still cobbled. So walking up these cobble streets, and straight away in front of us, we can see the Menin Gate, this great big gateway. It's going to carry the names of 54,000 soldiers who are missing We don't know where they are. Now, I just need to quantify that a little bit as we're walking towards it so we can talk about it. We'll see a lion facing us on the right on the top. But missing doesn't necessarily mean that you are out in the paddocks, that you're out in the field still, then you could be in a cemetery. What it means is that we do not know where you are. So you could have been recovered and be buried in a cemetery, but if you are an unknown soldier. Now, you may be an unknown soldier of the Devonshire Regiment or an unknown Australian soldier, but you are unknown. So we don't know where you are. So that's what missing means. It doesn't mean that you've been blown to smithereens. Well, in fact, sadly, of course, in some cases, that's exactly what it means. But for an awful lot of them, it just means that we don't know where your last resting place is. So 54,000 names on the memorial. And I think Field Marshal Lord Plummer, when he inaugurated it, he is not missing, he is here. His words were very clever. And I think he got it spot on. He is not missing, he is here. And that's what this is about. This is a place for people to come to who do not know where their relative is buried. And I look upon it really as it's to compensate from that lack of knowledge. You know, it's we may not know where he is, but look what we've put his name on. You know, you can come and commemorate him and remember him here. So that's what it was all about. It's all about finding a location that commemorates those that are missing. And I think it does an absolutely wonderful job. Now, it's odd in the sense that it has traffic flowing through it for most of the day, apart from an hour, and we're going to talk about it, 1 hour every night, the traffic is stopped. But other than that, it's a working road. So you have to say, thankfully, they had the foresight to realise that traffic would continue to use this road, and so it's wide enough that it will never need to be altered. And you can get a coach underneath it with no problem, as I very often do, drive a coach through the Menin Gate. So it's a beautiful thing, inaugurated on the 24th of July, 1927. So it took some time to, first of all, to organise where they were going to put it, to get permissions to put it here. It was a great location, and it was a location that was already being used by those battlefield pilgrims that started immediately. 1918, when the war finished, people started coming here. Now, the first people that came were women dressed in black. These are the wives and mothers of the soldiers that died here and very often were missing. And they're coming because they can't understand that term missing. Now, one of the only places that they knew for a fact they'd been through would be the Menin Gate, or what was known as the Gap by Australian troops, onto the Menin Road, because almost everybody at some stage went out onto the battlefield via the Menin Road, so hence through the Menin Gate, as it is now, the Gap. And so people started laying wreaths here. People started commemorating their relatives here at this point on the ramparts. So what I should say is that this is a gap in the ramparts, the defences that go right the way around the city, or did once, they no longer do. And so this is one of the gaps in the fortifications, because this was a very much a fortified town. So the ramparts running right the way around, and this gap is a place where you knew that your relative almost certainly went out onto the battlefields through this area. So it became a place of commemoration and a place of memory even before the gate was built. And so that's why the gate is in such a good place, the Menin Gate. For those of you that perhaps have done a little research on the Menin Gate, you may recognise this description of a painting of the gate called the Menin Gate at Midnight by an Australian artist called Will Longstaff. It's the most moving painting taken from outside. He was painting in the 1920s, the late 20s, when this gateway was just completed. So after 1928, probably around the period of the Great Pilgrimage, when lots and lots of servicemen came back here, 10 years after the ending of the war. And it depicts the gate lit, as it still is. It's lit every evening by lighting, and beautiful picture. Until you look carefully, what you think are lots of flowers are these ghostly figures of soldiers in their thousands marching out via the gate and in the landscape around the gate. So go and have a look online. I'm sure you'll find it. The Menin Gate at Midnight by Will Longstaff. In 1930, the last post committee was formed because almost immediately the fire brigade picked up the idea of perhaps we should do a last post here. that the traffic should stop, and we'll play the last post every evening. It's a thank you from the people of the town to all of those servicemen from around the empire who fought and died here in some cases. So the last post is played every night. Now it's played at 8 o'clock, and a lot of people say, why 8 o'clock? Why isn't it at sunset rather than 8 o'clock? Well, it's because if it changed every night to a different time, it would get very confusing for those people visiting. And 8 o'clock is about the mean average from the winter to summer. So they've always the sun doesn't set until very late, 9 o'clock or almost 9:30. So it was just felt that 8 o'clock was the right time. It also allows you to have a meal before or a meal after, if you wish, before it takes place. And so the last post is paid by buglers from the fire brigade, but now run completely by this committee, the last post committee, and they do an excellent job, you have to say, because an awful lot of people, well, not in the last 2 years, but an awful lot of people normally go, and certainly in the years of the centenary commemorations, so people from 1914 to 1918, we were getting thousands and thousands of people at the gate. And I remember going before that period with my parents on a winter's night, and we went there and there was about 6 people there. So you can get quiet nights, but not since the build up to the centenary and post the centenary. I have been during the COVID outbreak. Actually, we had one small opportunity when we could go to Belgium, and I did visit. And even then, I think probably about 300 people there. No English speaking people. Excuse me. No English speaking. Should I say English speaking people? Because an awful lot of the Flemish people speak, and the Dutch people that very often go speak English, but no from English speaking countries. So from the old empire or America or Canada or wherever. But there were no English voices there. It was very, very different, very unusual, but still. 400 people who were obviously very interested and realised the significance, or perhaps in some cases don't. But it doesn't matter. I think the most important thing is that people go. So I'm really looking forward to it. We've just literally this week we've been told that people can now travel again from Britain to France. So hopefully we'll start to get people going, and certainly because the town needs it.
Pete, it's an amazing experience. I've been in the times I've been over, the 3 times that I've actually been over and with you on the battlefields, and it's something that I think that every Australian should do, or anyone who listens to this podcast, if they get an opportunity to get over, they need to go to the last post service at 8 o'clock. It's something, it's very moving, isn't it, Pete? Like you have to get there. You have to get there early, because if you want a spot right at the front, you have to get there an hour before, because the people just come from everywhere, don't they, Pete? They just they're like 1 minute. It's amazing.
You get caught out as well, because they come from both directions. If you've come from the town, which most of my, when I'm with my clients, certainly, and you've parked in the town square, or you've been eating a meal in the square, or you're coming from your hotel, you tend to come from the square, and you look up the road, you think, it's quiet, there's nobody up there yet. And so I'll just have another quick pint, or I'll have another bag of chips or whatever. And then you look next time, it's full, because the coaches park on the far side of it, and everybody piles in from the far side. When it's really busy, you only need a modern coach, 60 odd people on a modern coach, half a dozen coaches, and it's full. It's almost full underneath, so you cannot then get underneath because it's standing room only. So it's so it can be very interesting. I mean, I've been up there when there's been 4,000 or 5,000 people there. So you're halfway down the road. You can't get anywhere near the actual main gate. So the periods of the centenaries, especially a lot of my clients are Australians, and on these on the centenaries, and people had come from such a long distance. So the last thing you want to do is find that you're not even under the main gate, you're outside. So we'd get there at 6:30. We'd be there at 6:30. The service doesn't start till 8 o'clock, and it only goes on for 20 minutes. And so it's half an hour at maximum. But it's all about the atmosphere. It's about getting there. If you're going to come from a long way, make sure you allow the time to get up there. The handy thing is there's a bar right beside the gate. So if you're there, you are there very early. I keep talking about beer. I don't know what's going on tonight. I've obviously had a lack of beer in recent months. You can go to the bar and you can actually go and get a quick drink in there, and you can keep your eye on it, and then just bail out when you think it's the right time. So a great place to go. And every service is slightly different. I should just stress that, because you think, well, that's weird. It's last post. But so the order of service is basically you have an introduction by one of the last post association, basically saying to the uninitiated, do not clap, do not talk during the service. Then you have hell no, I haven't listened to it for such a long time. I'm having to think about it. You have the ode. No, the last post. So the last post is the first thing. So let's think about it, Pete. Concentrate. It's the last post first of all. Then you have the ode, and then you have the wreath laying. And during that period when people are laying wreaths, because you can put your name forward, you can apply online. If you go look at the Last Post Association Eep, you'll find it online. You can lay a wreath or a poppy cross or something. Most people get these poppy wreaths. You can buy them in the town, or you can get some fresh flowers. Some people lay fresh flowers. And you walk across the road, obviously no traffic. You're not having to avoid the traffic. Lay your wreath, walk back. Well, while that's going on, they sometimes have some incidental music. So if they have a bagpiper or a trombonist or a violinist or a choir, I've seen almost everything you can imagine. And so that goes on, and it goes on for the period when they are laying their wreaths. And then we have the reveille, and it's all over. So it's if there's not very many people laying wreaths and there's no incidental music, grab my water, and then you can, and then it's finished, and then you can go back into the town and have a meal after it, or go into a bar and enjoy some of the famous. I'm talking about it again. The famous Flemish beers. So that's the great thing. It's a short ceremony, but it is on every single night. And it has been since 1928. It started after the inauguration. It kind of fine-tunes it. The Last Post Association, 1930. But it's on every single night. Of course, it didn't take place in that little period from 1940 to 1944 when it wasn't popular. And that's because the Germans are back and they weren't very keen on it. But other than that, it's taken place every night and will continue to do so.
And we should mention, Pete, that as soon as the town was liberated in 1944, and I've heard this story, Pete, that it was actually while there was still skirmish fighting outside the town, they actually came back, and that first night there was still skirmishes outside of the town, but they did, as soon as they liberated the town in 1944, they started again. So yeah, it's an amazing thing, Pete. It's an amazing foresight to, the Belgian, like the Belgian Fire Brigade. They're not just remembering their own war dead. They're remembering the Commonwealth, and it's it's amazing. You get so many nations coming to this. It'd be an amazing thing if it was just the Belgian army that they remembered, but they're remembering everyone who fought for their country, really. And it's an amazing. I have to stress, Pete, it's an amazing experience, and you've said it and I've said it. If you get the opportunity, it's a must. You have to go to the Last Post service. It's absolutely, it's so moving, isn't it, Pete?
Oh, it's extraordinary. And I have to say, Adam, one of the things when you said that every nation, at some stage, people go there, and certainly of the combative nations of the First World War, then they do, including the Germans, because NATO headquarters it basically is just outside of Brussels in Belgium, and very often you get groups of soldiers coming down from NATO headquarters, including German soldiers. And I know some people find it quite strange that I don't have any problem with it whatsoever. And I think it's very moving that the Germans want to be here as well. I've even seen a German unit actually parading underneath the men engaged and commemorating their dead and commemorating our dead, the Empire dead, as well. So it's and that's one of the great things. You never know who's going to turn up at the service. I was there one year, and a big black limousine whistled up just before the service started, and I've forgotten the name now. Quentin. Oh dear, that's not good. Australian ambassador.
Ambassador or Governor General?
Not sure. I think I'll not talk about this because I can't remember. I had a name in my head then.
Quentin Bryce?
Quentin Bryce, thank you. Well done, Adam.
Our ex-Governor General, one of our
pull me out of the poo, as they say.
No, that's Quentin Bryce. Yeah, Quentin Bryce.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so so you never know. You never know who's going to be there. There's all sorts of interesting people. So that's one of the great things of soaking up the atmosphere. If not, you just start talking to the person behind you or beside you, and that's one of the interesting things. People are very keen to tell the story of why they're there. So it's a great experience.
So Pete, we're talking about the Manning Gate, and so it's half a triumph arch, half a mausoleum, and so Pete, who actually designed the Manning Gate itself?
Yeah, it's a chap called Sir Reginald Blomfield. Now, he's one of the architects that has been working for the, as it was then, Imperial War Graves on the Western Front, so he's one of the great and good. I describe him. He's at the height of his powers. Him and a chap called Lutyens, who are doing an awful lot of the memorials. There's quite a few books about them both. If you want to look up Sir Reginald Blomfield or many of the other architects. There's also going to be a book about some of the minor architects that were working on the battlefields. I'm going to go off on a tangent if I'm not careful, and that's due to come out quite soon. So I'm looking forward to that. A lot of those were servicemen, officers who had qualified as architects, and they are effectively roped in. They volunteered their services in building a lot of these cemeteries that needed designing and the great memorials as well, but they tend to be the great and good. So Sir Reginald Blomfield, a fantastic architect. There's always people that don't think it's too triumphant. You see the triumphant arch, and it's very much based upon the Roman arches, and obviously we see something very similar in Paris with Napoleon and Napoleon's arch, the Arc de Triomphe, which is in the center of Paris, and it's that kind of imagery, but it's the carrying the names of the missing that really lifts it to the next phase. The great thing is you can walk up the sides of it. It's within the rampart, so you can go left or right up. Both interestingly have a slope, so you could even get wheelchairs up there or stairs. If you're not during the service, you can walk up the stairs literally underneath the archway and up onto the top to get a view. At the moat, there's a moat on the far side of it that runs around the town, and you can then set off on a walk around the rampart. So it's just a fantastic building, a fantastic site, and unusually, it still has some damage on it, and people then get very confused. Well, what's the damage on it? Where's that from? Well, that's from the Second World War. Most of it was patched up and replaced, and you can see those patches of where it was damaged during the Second World War when the Germans arrived in 1940.
And Pete, you can also see the lions of the patient. You mentioned the lion, so the patient lion on top is the Lion of Britain, but it's also known as the Lion of Flanders.
Yeah, now that's a little confusing because the lion is a symbol of Flanders, but the lions are very different. The lions on top are benign, will be a term that they use. They are empire lions. Empire lions are never growly. And there's a story there as well, which I won't go off onto, but it involves another memorial. But the empire lions are generally not growly. They have this benign look. I always describe it as the look of an overseer. It's like you're looking down on everybody and making sure that everything is well in the world. Now, the Flemish lions, the city lions, are definitely growly lions. And if we walk through from, as we just walked up to the Manning Gate. We're now going to walk through the Manning Gate and out the other side. And very clearly, we can see two plinths. And on those plinths at each side, we can see two very different lions. Now, these lions are beautiful. They've been very well carved. They're in a very different stone. It's a dark granity stone. I'm not sure if it is granite, but whatever it is, it looks a little granity. A dark stone. In fact, I'm fairly certain it's not granite, but whatever it is. And they are looking out. They're looking up the Manning Gate. So we'll walk past them and then look back at them. There are plaques on the plinths that explain the whole story. And it's a very moving story because these are replicas of the original lions that were destroyed or very badly damaged during the First World War that stood where these lions now stand again. Now, those lions, it's a long story, which I'm going to abbreviate, but effectively those lions were donated to Australia or given to Australia for the new, which at the time was just going to be a museum, and we now know it as the War Memorial in Canberra. They were going to become centerpieces in the museum. And in fact, for those that have been there, you'll know exactly where they are. They are at the top of the stairs as you're walking into the museum itself. on the left and the right. Well, those are the original lions that were donated to Australia. They were then renovated, and you can look carefully at them. You'll see that they've been glued back together and patched up and new bits made because they were so badly damaged. But they were donated, and that's where they are. Well, on the centenary of the fighting, so 2017, the fighting on the third Battle of Eep, Passchendaele, where Australia fought so hard on the right-hand side of the battlefield, fighting on the ridges, places like Polygon Wood, Broodsind, and eventually Passchendaele itself, and other battles, Battle of the Menin Road as well. And previously around Hill 60, and of course the tunnel is on Hill 60. So there's a history of Australia fighting upon the ridges, and so it was decided that they would come back for just that year, for 2017. They would arrive on Anzac Day and be unveiled for Anzac Day, and after the armistice on the 11th of November, they would be returned. They actually stayed a bit longer than that eventually. But that was the idea, that they would come from Australia, and that's exactly what happened. And they built these plinths for them. And I just found it unbelievably moving that these would be returned to their town of origin just for this centenary. But I did wonder, wouldn't it be nice? I didn't want them to remain. Quite a few people said, well, wouldn't it be nice if they stayed? And I said, well, no, that's the whole point of them. They've come back to recharge their Belgian batteries, and then they're going back to Australia again, was my description. But I did think, wouldn't it be nice if Australia paid for some replicas to be created? And that's exactly what happened. Australia paid for replicas to be made out of exactly the same stone, to be carved, hand-carved, beautifully hand-carved by Belgian craftsmen, and they were then placed on the plinths, replacing the originals that went back to Australia, and that's where they will be for forever now. So they are a fantastic addition, especially if you know the story of how they end up there. And these beautiful lions, and I have to say, in better nick than the originals, considerably better nick, because these are just been created. So wonderful story, and well worth going to have a good look at the lions. And in fact, if you can't remember anything I've been saying, it's on the plinths. You get the full story there. You can read it.
I must say, Pete, when I first came over in 2015 with you, and they started, it was an odd scene when you walk through and you just saw where the lions, where they are now. You just saw these brick pillars, and you were like, well, what's going on here? What's this?
Yeah.
Like, it looked so strange, just having a brick pillar in the middle of the walkway, and you look and go, what's this? And it was for seeing what was coming in 2017 for the centenary. And then, yeah, Pete, I like that they've got the lions there now, and they're beautiful replicas. They are, and the originals are beautiful as well. They're a beautiful, as you walk up the stairs at the memorial at Canberra, they are beautiful. They're a beautiful thing, and a very, very great gift that we were given back in, I think it was 1932. I think it was, Pete, that they were donated to Australia. I'm pretty sure. From my notes, I think that I'm
going to completely agree with you, because I don't know. So I'm not sure. I think one went before the other. There is a story which I'm not going to go into. Also, because I'm not so sure nowadays. I used to tell a really long-winded story about the lions and their arrival in Australia, but I need to really do a bit more digging to make sure that story is absolutely correct. I hate telling stories that are a bit hearsay, so I'm not going to tell it. Perhaps I'll let you listeners dig into the story of the lions and their arrival in Australia. But I think there's a bit more behind it than meets the eye.
I think so too, and there's a DVD, Pete, the Meningate Lions. There's an actual DVD that you can watch, and it gives you the history. And I'm sure, Pete, there'll be someone that one of the listeners will say, "Oh, Adam, you're wrong with your date," and but yeah, I think it was roughly 1932. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Pete, we mentioned, so we should talk about the names on the walls themselves, and so as you said, 54,000 names commemorated on the walls of the Meningate, and there's a cutoff date on the names that are on the walls. So can you tell us what this date was, and what happened to the other names? Yeah. Where are they, Pete?
Right. It's a little confusing, because you start looking at the names on the gate, and yes, all the Australians who died and are missing in the salient. No, not in the salient. In Belgium. If you're an Australian soldier and you're missing, and you went missing when you were serving in Belgium, then you will be on the gate, and that's the same for the Canadians, the South Africans, the Newfoundlanders, the Indians, and the British. But there's a proviso for the British. There are no New Zealanders on the gate at all, because they decided they wanted to commemorate their missing on each battlefield. So their names are on each battlefield, and there's just a panel that commemorates and gives you an overall total for New Zealanders missing in Belgium. I think it's New Zealanders. I think that's what the figure is. But anyway, even if it isn't, it's commemorating New Zealanders who are missing. For Britain, if we'd allocated all of our missing just for the salient, and this is not the whole of Belgium, just for the salient, they would have filled the whole memorial and more. And that wasn't really what was intended. And they certainly didn't want to build the memorial higher or bigger or longer or whatever. It just wouldn't have felt right. So what they decided to do was at Tynecott, the largest Commonwealth War grave cemetery in the world, and I think we may have done it on a previous podcast, or we'll perhaps be going to do it on a new podcast. But Tynecott Cemetery, 12,000. These are being rounded up and down, so 12,000 burials there. Largest Commonwealth War grave cemetery in the world. But what they decided to do was to build a wall around the back of it, and on that wall it would carry the names of the missing from the August onwards. There is an exact date, but I can't remember off the top of my head what it is, but it's the August of 1917, because the fighting is effectively getting nearer and nearer to the cemetery as we force the Germans up and off the ridges and out of the salient. It was decided that the rest of the names of the missing would be put there. Another 36,000.
30.
Is that some right, Adam?
It's the 15th of August, 1917 was the cutoff date, and 34,984 are missing on the Tynecott Memorial.
Yeah, so 35,000. So 35,000 on that on the back wall. If you'd have brought that 35,000 down onto the gate, then it would have filled it. And if you'd have brought the rest of the missing of Belgium for Britain on, it would completely filled it. So I think it's the perfect thing to do. So we have all of the empire apart from New Zealand missing commemorated on the gate, and then we have the rest of them up here at Tynecott. So anyway, back down to the gate. The other thing I should say for Australia, so it's just I'm only mentioning Australia because it's interesting. 6,176 Australians named on the gate. But what do you do if you're found? And of course, you have to think about that. There's been an awful lot of people found since this was inaugurated in 1928, which is when they were literally the names were set in stone. Well, what has happened to people that were found and identified since then? So not just Australians. This is everybody. I just mentioned the Australian number of Australians on the wall there. But if you imagine what's going to happen, is a man going to turn up with a chisel and chisel a name off because you've been found? Because if you've been found, you've got the grave and your name's on the grave, and in theory you can only be commemorated in one location. Let's chisel his name off there. And thankfully, they decided it would deface the memorial to have these gaps, because what they would do, they wouldn't chisel it off and leave a chisel marks. They would neatly chisel out the name and then put a patch in, but you'd then have gaps. You'd have gaps in the run of names, and so it was decided not to do that. Interestingly, if you want to see what it looks like, if you're going to France and onto the Somme battlefields to the Tynecott Memorial, then they did chisel the names out there for a while, and you can see these patches where the names are missing and they've been taken out as those soldiers were found, and actually their bodies receive a proper burial. So we don't see that on this memorial, which I think is a good thing. But what it does mean is that actually it doesn't quite work out. If you were to go around and count all the names and look at a modern register, because the modern registers are kept up to date. So if a soldier is found, then they will actually remove the name from the register. So if you were to look at the number of names in the register and then count the number of names on the walls, it wouldn't add up. You would actually have more names on the walls. So it's just an interesting comment. If you're looking for somebody and you're confused and you've found the grave and you've also found him on the memorial, then that is possible, and it tells you straight away that he he's been found subsequent to the memorial being completed.
It's an interesting point, Pete, and I think I like that. Like you, I like that they don't remove the names and the gaps. I think it looks better that they just leave the names there, and I think it's a good thing that obviously they've got their grave and they're remembered. But I think they leave no gaps. I think it just works and flows a lot better, and yeah.
There's something else that they do there as well, which is, if you've been to lots of the memorials for the missing, you'd recognise that there is or can be a problem, and that is that all the names are inked in. In other words, they're in black. So as well as being cut very cleverly, and the typeface was designed deliberately to cast a shadow in sunlight so that you can read the names without them being inked in. But of course, these are underneath an archway, and it means the sun doesn't shine in there, and so they don't particularly cast a shadow. So for those that are high up, it'd be quite difficult to read. So they actually ink the names in. So it's they're inked in. It makes it very easy to read. Now, I have a great uncle who's on the Arras Memorial to the Missing. He's Smith, so there's a lot of us as well to start off with. He's up near the top. I cannot see his name. I need to take some ladders to go up there at some stage. I know he's up there, and you can kind of squint and look at an angle, and you think, oh, there he is. I can just about see his head, and you can't photograph it. And I hope one day they will do the same there, that they will actually ink them in. So it's I suspect they probably won't, because the Commonwealth War Graves like sticking to the designs of how these were originally intended to be, and that was never intended to have the names inked in. So I suspect that they're not going to. But certainly on the Menin Gate, it's much easier to read because they are inked in, and it makes it's very helpful if you're trying to track down a relative.
Because they're done in their regiments, aren't they, Pete? That's how they're actually put in their regiments, and that's how the names are actually listed.
Yeah. But for some of the Commonwealth, the Empire countries, Canada and Australia, they're very often by battalion numbers, so it's by battalion rather than regiment. For the British regimental system, they are commemorated under their regimental distinction, and then it's by rank, alphabetical. So very quickly you can find the relative. If he's a sergeant in the Devonshire Regiment, you literally go to Devonshire Regiment, down through the ranks from the officers first, obviously in the most senior first, down through the ranks till you get to the sergeants, and then it's alphabetical within the sergeants. So it makes it simple once you've got the hang of the system. The hard part is figuring out where your regiment is on the memorial. Well, thankfully, there are books, registers in a little box at the memorial. So if you've got time, you can go and find them. But one of the things I should have said, as we walk down the street from the centre of the town, there is now on the left-hand side, just before you get to the gate, there is now an office. Well, it's more of a shop front for the Commonwealth War Graves, and you can dive in there. They're open just up until the ceremony starts. Might even be open after it, not sure. And you can dive in there and have a chat with whoever's on duty, and they will help you find the name or how to find the name. So great resource now that we have that. If we were walking the other direction, we'd go by the offices of the Commonwealth War Graves within the town. But this is much better. To actually have a shop front is great. They also have permanent guides, and hopefully they will be returning up at Tynecott Cemetery as well. So you can go to the little shop front here at the Menin Gate, but if you go up to Tynecott Cemetery, then there are actually guides there during the day as well.
And Pete, for our Australian listeners, the Australians are listed on the left-hand side as you go up the stairs. They're all on the left-hand side as you go right up the stairs. They're around I think it's halfway around the left-hand side, Pete, of the panels as you walk up the stairs. And
up the stairs.
Yeah, they're all listed along there. So for our Australian listeners, if you do get over there, I've just given you a little handy hint of where the Australians are listed. So the 6,000 of them. So, and we should mention, Pete, for some people who like to know this, there's 8 recipients of the Victoria Cross are commemorated and listed under their respective regiments. Lance Corporal Frederick Fish, he was an Irish Canadian. Brigadier General Charles Fitzclarence, he is the highest ranking commemorated on the memorial. Got Company Sergeant Major Frederick Hall, another Canadian. You've got Second Lieutenant Dennis George Hewitt, Lieutenant Hugh Mackenzie, he's another Canadian, Captain John Valentine, Private Edward Warner, and Second Lieutenant Sydney Woodruff. So there's 8 VCs commemorated on the Meningate Memorial.
And they actually have that abbreviation VC before their names, so you can actually spot them, or is it after their names? I think I can't remember after their names.
After their names, Pete. It's after their names.
After their names. Yeah. So yes, you can spot them very easy. I've just been quickly looking at my notes. I'm just going to correct myself, Alan, because I said that the town was defortified at the time of Napoleon, but on my notes I've got it was defortified the town on the formation of Belgium in 1852. And we have to remember that Belgium doesn't come into being until 1852, but prior to that it was part of either Holland or France or the Spanish Netherlands prior to that. So it may have been defortified then. The other thing to point out, and I haven't mentioned him so far, and I think this will have to wait for another podcast, is to talk about the guy that basically built the walls as we see them today, Vauban. And Vauban is a French military engineer working in the late or in the 1700s, and he is, in fact, if you visit Paris and you go to Napoleon's tomb, then Vauban is such an important character for the defense of France that he is buried within Napoleon's mausoleum. He's on the right-hand side, so he's the first burial within his mausoleum on the right-hand side in Paris. If you go to the Invalides and go and have a look at Napoleon's tomb, well worth a visit there as well. The military museum is fantastic, and go and have a look at Napoleon's tomb. He is not buried with his horse, just for those that may have heard that story. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent again.
No. It's you often hear that, Pete. You often hear that. Yeah, I've heard that story myself when I've been over there. So yeah, it's not I know exactly what you're talking about. So, but yeah, no, we'll definitely be getting on to another podcast, Pete, because I think maybe it's a good place to finish today, and we can talk about the ramparts in the next podcast when we pick it up. So I think it's a good place to end, Pete. I mean, what do you think, Pete? I'm happy to continue.
Well, I think I think you're right, Adam. I don't think we needed to strap our boots on, though. We could have had our carpet slippers on for that one. It wasn't very far.
No, you're right, Pete. You're right. No, it was but I'm glad you said cobblestones, Pete, and you like them, because I can honestly say now I haven't walked them in boots, but I can tell you, walking them in shoes, Pete, it's not much fun.
Yeah, high heels are a problem. Not that I would know personally, of course.
No. But no, Pete, I think it's a good place to end. So I think we'll end at the gate today, and we'll pick it up. We'll pick it up in a couple of weeks' time, and we'll actually walk the ramparts, and we'll end up at another gate, Pete, another gate, and another important part of the story, and we'll go into a couple of cemeteries, and we'll continue our walk as we walk around the town of Ypres. So thank you for coming on and just giving us a little taste and bit of history of the town and why it was so significant during the Great War.
Pleasure, Adam. Look forward to continuing the war.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you feel like supporting us, you can now via our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/truebluehistory, or buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/truebluehistory, and check out our new website, truebluehistory.com, for more great content.